It's March 12, 1938. German troops march over the border into Austria and seize the country without firing a shot. Rather, they are greeted with bouquets and applause. As Adolf Hitler is greeted by thousands in Vienna and Linz, frightened Jews, leftists, and other critics of the Nazi regime march towards the borders of the state, hoping that they can reach them before they close. Most of them were, however, arrested in rapidly Nazifying Austria. The following weeks witnessed pogrom-style violence running wild in the country. Austrian Nazis and others attack Jews, beat them up, and humiliate them. They force them to sweep the streets, scrub public toilets, and do humiliating exercises. Hitler appoints Baldur von Schirach as the new Reichsgouverneur and NS-Gauleiter in Vienna in August 1940. Together with his wife, he will plunder public money and Jewish property. His wife's name is Henriette von Schirach. Henriette von Schirach was born on February 2, 1913 in Munich in the then German Reich. Her father, Heinrich Hoffmann, was a photographer, and her mother, Therese Baumann, a former actress and singer, died suddenly and unexpectedly in 1928, when Henriette was just 15 years old. Henriette's father, Adolf Hitler, passed away in 1919, and in April of the following year became a party member of the NSDAP. Hitler assumed the leadership of the NSDAP in 1921, and 2 years later appointed Hoffmann as his official photographer. No one but Hoffmann was allowed to take pictures of him. Hoffmann tried to place Hitler in the role of the representative of the German people, which itself was not an easy task, as the future Führer did not fit the image of the idealized Nordic nation. Therefore, Hoffmann tried to photograph Hitler in the most favorable manner and to draw the viewer's attention to his eyes, which were considered by everybody to be dreamy and hypnotic. At the age of 8 or 9, Henriette had had her first meeting with Hitler, who would visit Hoffmann's Munich home to eat. At the age of 17, Hitler made a pass at her. She later regretted, "I was only 17, and he was more than 40 years old." Then he turned around and asked me in a serious tone, "Would you kiss me?" I told him no. He turned and walked out and closed the door. I reported it to my dad when he came home. I was made fun of by him, and he laughed and said, "You stupid goose, you dreamed it up." As Hitler's personal photographer, Heinrich made millions with the sale of Hitler's photographs. His photographs of Hitler were reproduced on postcards, posters, and in picture books. It employed 300 people and had a turnover of 58 million Reichsmarks in its most successful year, 1943, which is about $550 million US today. Henriette Hoffmann was Hitler's secretary in 1930 when she was a student at the University of Munich. She wrote to a new powerful members of the NSDAP and Hitler's niece Jelly Robbel, who committed suicide in 1931, and the former intern of her father, Eva Braun, Hitler's wife, who also committed suicide. In 1931, Henriette Baldur von Schirach met, the leader of the National Socialist German Student Union and the youngest in Hitler's entourage. The couple married on March 31, 1932 in Munich, with Adolf Hitler and Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, as witnesses. The reception took place in Hitler's private apartment, and Henriette's wealthy father paid them a luxurious apartment in Munich. In 1933 to 1942, Henriette bore 4 children: Angelica Benedicta, Klaus, Robert, and Richard. Henriette von Schirach was a member of the NSDAP when she was married, but she was not a member of the party apparatus. Baldur von Schirach and his father-in-law authored some propaganda books, which sold 100,000 copies, and Schirach and Hoffmann made good money. Adolf Hitler and the NSDAP seized power in January 1933. On June 17th of the same year, Baldur von Schirach was appointed leader of German Reich Youth and in charge of all the nation's youth organizations. He was also a regular visitor to party rallies with Hitler in an attempt to encourage and revitalize the Hitler Youth. The largest assembly was annually in Nuremberg when Hitler Youth members from all over Germany assembled for the annual Reichsparteitag. Since the Hitler Youth and their female counterpart, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, were considered by Nazi authorities to be Aryan in character, premarital sex between them was promoted. At the 1936 Nuremberg Reichsparteitag, attended by some 100,000 youth group members, 900 females between 15 and 18 years old went home pregnant. Both the Bund Deutscher Mädel and the Hitler Youth were headed by Baldur von Schirach and were the prime tools by which the Nazis indoctrinated youth with their ideology and thereby influenced the faith, thought, and actions of youth in Germany. Henriette embraced the objectives of her husband and the NSDAP. In March of 1936, the Schirachs purchased Aspenstein Castle in Kassel MC and started to modernize the country house shortly thereafter. The Second World War began on September 1, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Baldur von Schirach was named Reichsgouverneur and NS-Gauleiter in Vienna, Austria, on August 8, 1940. As city district mayor of Vienna, a position he held until the end of the war in 1945, Schirach coordinated the deportation of Vienna's Jews, which he justified in a speech on September 14, 1942, as follows. "If you would like to blame me for deporting tens of thousands of Jews out of this city in ghettos in the East, I must reply, I consider it my active contribution to the culture of Europe." Schirach deported 65,000 Jews from the concentration camps. Schirach relocated to Vienna with his family, and Henriette was very glad about the relocation. Schirachs were still living in huge luxuries and had no hesitation in embezzling public money or Jewish assets. Their house was full of furniture, paintings, carpets, and wall carpets of Jewish assets. Jews who had fled the nation also possessed the house in which they were staying. A stolen painting purchased by Schirach with Hitler's authorization for 30,000 Reichsmark for the older Lucas Cranach. Another of Peter Bruegel the Younger's works was stolen by Jews who were sent to the ghetto der Scienstadt and died there. Schirach acquired it for 24,000 Reichsmark, again with Hitler's authorization. Overall, Schirachs purchased paintings for hundreds of thousands of Reichsmark and sold all, but a few of them for a profit. In 1943, Henriette von Schirach was taken by German occupation force friends to occupied Holland. She subsequently claimed, which was a huge error, and she did just that. Henriette put off her trip to Holland and visited the Berghof, Hitler's country retreat on the Obersalzberg in the Bavarian Alps, to make an appointment to visit Hitler. Years later, Henriette explained what occurred. I stood up and told him, "Mr. Hitler, you must not do this. I felt I could because I had known him all these years. I have hurt him badly, even in front of other men who were present." Then Hitler spoke, "You are sentimental. What do the Jews in the Netherlands say about you? This is nothing but emotional nonsense, humanitarian nonsense. 10,000 of my best men die on the battlefield daily, and the rest live in the camps. This implies that the biological balance in Europe is no longer correct." Henriette turned her back, let him yell, and ran downstairs that divided the large hall from the corridor. Henriette and her husband Baldur were never invited again. Following this event, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels documented in his diary in 1943 that the Schirachs had suddenly realized their sympathy after nearly 60,000 Jews were deported prior to their doorstep. Schirach's mother Emma burned to death on July 16, 1944, after an airplane had crashed into her residence and she attempted to rescue her dog. Following that, Schirach was always anxious about the Allied air raids and evacuated her children to Aspenstein Castle, then Henriette in late autumn 1944. His art collection was shipped separately. Vienna was bombed by the Red Army on April 2, 1945, and advanced ever closer to the city center until April 9th. On this day, Schirach issued a last call to the people to fight to the last man. But Baldur himself did not fight, but evacuated his headquarters and flew with the 6th Panzer Army to the west, to Tyrol, where on May 2nd he dropped his uniform and, under the pseudonym Richard Falk in the Austrian city of Schwarz, joined the underground. On June 5th, Schirach, officially now declared dead, shocked everyone by making himself known and surrendering to the American city commander. He was apprehended by the 103rd Spionage Defense. Schirach was indicted in the Nuremberg trials, which were held against the top leaders of the vanquished NS regime. At the trial, Baldur von Schirach was one of only a few defendants to denounce Hitler. He received a 20-year prison sentence in Berlin. The life of privilege and luxury was not for Henriette and her children anymore. Aspenstein Castle was besieged in 1946, and according to her memoirs, Henriette von Schirach was imprisoned by the U.S. Army for more than a year. She was made to clean the toilets as part of her daily routine. Her Hitler Youth flags were to be employed to clean. She remembers having been beaten and insulted by the U.S. white soldiers. The only good treatment she got was from the black soldiers. Her father, Heinrich Hoffmann, was also arrested and jailed. Thus the Schirach children suddenly found themselves without parents or grandparents to look after them. They were adopted by farm families temporarily in the south of Bavaria and attended school there. Henriette von Schirach was divorced in July 1949, while her husband was still in prison. The divorce was completed the next year, and she penned a heartbreaking final letter to Baldur. Have you ever, instead of sitting in your cell and reading philosophy, Latin and French, composing poems and wondering how you can make your part in history, as you say, straight, have you ever gazed into the eyes of reality and wondered where the next meal for your wife and children would be? However, she went to London in 1958 to seek a diminution of her prison time. She spoke of her former husband as in no sense a criminal, but an idealist and much too good for politics. But her effort was futile, and Baldur von Schirach was released from prison on September 30th, 1966, having spent his entire sentence. He was half-blind in one eye and paid the cost for a thrombosis. Meanwhile, Henriette had decided to resume her old life of riches and luxuries. Within a period of 10 months, she sold the old home, Aspenstein Castle, for twice the amount paid in 1955. She then worked towards reclaiming her father's art collection. Her father was the one responsible for the plundering of many pieces of art by Jews who had been persecuted during the war. At the close of the war, he was arrested and classified by the Allied art plundering investigators as the main orchestrator of the Nazi plundering of art, both as an art dealer and collector. He was described as one of the greediest parasites of the Hitler Plague, and his art collection, consisting of many pieces of art seized by Jews, was confiscated by the Allies. Hoffmann, who had 278 pieces of art in his collection, passed away in 1957 at the age of 72. Decades following the Second World War, the American authorities returned the Bavarian state over 10,000 artworks, which were seized, so they could be returned to their rightful owners, most of whom were Jews, whose assets were seized. They also included the 287 artworks, which were seized by Heinrich Hoffmann. Henriette von Schirach and her family claimed these artworks from the authorities of the Bavarian art collection. Among them was a tiny oil landscape painting called Look at a Dutch Square by a Dutch artist named Jan van der Heide, known to be the best architectural painter of the Dutch Golden Age of the Netherlands. The painting used to belong to Gottlieb and Mathilde Kraus before the war, Jews who had evacuated their Vienna apartment and had carefully packed their art collection. It was seized by the Gestapo in 1941. Henriette von Schirach convinced the Bavarians, who had not planned to return the Kraus family portrait, to give it to her for a symbolic price of 300 German marks. A year later, Henriette sold it for 16,100 German marks, 50 times the price she had paid for it. She was eventually able to purchase 118 pieces from her father's collection, for which she produced sales receipts for them. 92 of them were simply returned to her, 26 she repurchased. Many of them she then resold, sometimes with astronomical profit margins. Rather than being returned to their original owners, they were returned to the families of Nazi war criminals like that of Schirach. After being divorced by Baldur von Schirach, Henriette remarried and divorced once more. She wrote 3 books: The Price of Glory, 1956, Anecdotes About Hitler, 1980, and Women About Hitler, 1983. She died on January 18, 1992, aged 78 years. On her deathbed, Henriette depicted Hitler as an Austrian hedonist who wanted to make himself and others slightly happier. A unique perspective on a dictator who will forever be remembered for orchestrating and executing one of history's most heinous crimes.